morning, our keynote speaker is a dear friend of mine. His name is Steve Smith, and he is, I like to think of him as one of the last of the old-time journalists. He has been in the business for 38 years. He started his career in Oregon. He has literally been all over the country. He has been an editor in Salem, Oregon, Colorado Springs, Colorado. He has served with Wright Knitter, can't even talk this morning, Knight Ritter in Miami, Florida, and the Wichita Eagle in Wichita, Kansas. He's also been with St. Paul Pioneer Press in Minnesota, the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, and the Registered Guard in Eugene, Oregon. Prior to coming to the University of Idaho, he was the editor of the Spokane Spokesman Review. He has been an ethicist for a long time. He really, truly understands this. He has worked with ethics issues, not only in the United States, but also several foreign countries. And we are delighted to have him not only here at UI as our ethics professor, but also here this morning to give our keynote presentation. So, Steve Smith.
Thank you.
How important is ethics in our society? Well, I've always said that it was important. I've always thought that being ethical in whatever our practice was vital. I think it's probably fair to say that in all aspects of American life right now, the concept of ethical behavior, responsible, accountable, transparent ethical behavior, is probably more important than it's been in generations. And in our business, in the media business, it's never been more important to be ethical. Missteps now in the current environment cause problems that reverberate far beyond a simple mistake. So ethics, understanding what we mean by ethics, understanding what we mean by responsibility, more important than ever before. And I'm proud to say that the University of Idaho is one of the very few journalism schools in the country that requires all of our students, regardless of discipline, advertising, PR, broadcast, film studies, journalism, to take a media ethics course. To get a degree from our school, you have to take my course or whoever subsequently teaches my course before you can get that degree. Take it as a junior or senior. So we value it here at the University of Idaho. This is a live discipline that we're talking about. Ethics is not theory. I don't teach ethical theory. Well, I take that back. I spend about 45 minutes in the course of a semester teaching classical Western ethical theory. I'll give you about 45 minutes of the philosophers, and then we step into the real world. This is a live discipline where, as journalists, as media practitioners, we deal with ethical problems literally every day and sometimes multiple times a day, and we're on our own. Back in my day, Becky talked about my career in newspapers, we published every 24 hours. And if we had an ethical dilemma, we had time. We could sit at the table, we could talk, we could noodle it. No more. You're in the field, you have to make your decision. Sometimes you have to make a decision in minutes. You have to have a framework for those decision-making processes. And you all, as student journalists, you're in the same boat. Take the student part away from it. In the media world, you're not viewed as student journalists. That's not how we view you. It's not how I view you. You are the real deal. I have a colleague who used to teach at the University of Missouri. She had a phrase. She called her students at the University of Missouri, of all places, baby Jays. That is so dismissive. You're not baby Jays. If you're publishing a newspaper, if you're posting news online, if you're providing information to your audience following the precepts of journalistic practice and the values of journalism, you're journalists. I don't care what comes in front of that term. So I view you as the real deal. You operate in a real world environment regardless of your platform. Regardless of your platform. Doesn't matter anymore. Back in the day, it was a newspaper. I was an editor of my high school paper. My high school doesn't publish a print paper anymore. They're entirely online. Doesn't make any difference. I'm going to get so frustrated with this machine. And you're part of a larger world, and you can't pretend that you're not. Sometimes I wish you could. I wish you could be insulated from the larger world and be young people and students, but in our business, in your business, social and political context matters because you operate in the real world. When the president calls the press enemies of the people, you're among the targeted. You're among the targeted. He's not thinking of you, but the people who hear that message apply that to the journalists that operate in their sphere, whether it's the journalists at the Moscow Pullman Daily News or the folks who read your journalism on whatever platform you distribute it. And to do your jobs as journalists, you have to accept certain things. Some people are going to consider you enemies. Maybe some of you have already had that experience. You write a news story that's not particularly flattering about your football team that has, this is an example, I have no idea what your football teams are doing, but a football team that is experiencing a losing season. And your sports editor writes an analysis and the football players are all bent out of shape. They don't see you as their friend, they see you as an enemy of their messaging. Your responsibility as journalists may transcend other considerations and obligations. In my ethics class, one of the things I try to tell our students, especially our journalism students, is that when you accept a role in media, you give up certain things. You give up some of your First Amendment rights under the system. You give up the opportunity to be buddy-buddy with everybody, because sometimes your work puts you in a position where you're not going to be appreciated, respected, or even liked. And you have to recognize that. It's one of the obligations that comes with the craft. You adopt the practices and the values and the ethical standards of the profession, or you find a different profession. This is our primary responsibility for all of us in journalism practice. This is our responsibility. Our responsibility, the highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism, is to serve the public. That's the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. It's the mother code for all the other media codes. It goes back to 1924. It was established by the organization at the time was called Sigma Delta Chi. Back in the day, there were professional fraternal organizations, not like Greek houses that we have on campus, but it was SDX, Sigma Delta Chi, becomes Society of Professional Journalists in the 1970s. Their code of ethics in 1924 has been updated multiple times, most recently in 2014, and I'll show you that here in just a second. But this is their fundamental statement. Highest and primary obligation of ethical journalism is to serve the public. Not your bosses, not your advertisers, not your buddies, not your teachers. Your primary obligation is to serve your public. And of course, we define our publics differently, right? When I was editor of the Spokesman Review, I had a certain kind of public. It was all of the folks who lived within my circulation and distribution area. Tens of thousands of people. That was my public. Your public is primarily within your school. But you got to understand who that public is. What is the public that you serve, and why and who do you serve these people? What's the point of it all? Who are they? Knowing who they are is different than knowing that you've got 200 seniors, 200 juniors, 180 sophomores, half men, half women. That's not understanding your public. You have to go much deeper to understand who your public might be. And in serving the public, we have this. This applies to all of us. Applies to every American citizen. So this is the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. It was not actually the first, it was the third of 13 proposed amendments drafted after the Constitution is approved. And some of the founders thought that the Constitution didn't provide protections for fundamental rights. And 10 of them are approved. We call those the Bill of Rights. This is the first of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Of course, one of the fundamentals about the First Amendment is it's about government action, not about private action. So it's about the government. The government cannot abridge these rights. But it's not absolute. There are exceptions to First Amendment protections. The government in general can't censor you before publication or speech. We call that prior restraint. Almost impossible for the government to do action before. After the fact, there are 6 areas where you can get in trouble for things that you might say are right. It's not absolute. And for you, in the high school journalism world, you don't enjoy full First Amendment protection. Becky will cover that when she talks about scholastic press law a little bit later. Ethically and morally, and in our view, the view of journalists in the world, you do. But by the nature of governance, scholastic press does not always enjoy these protections, which means that when we get to the end of my talk here, we have to frame things a little bit differently. You can go ahead and grab that. So, First Amendment, right? We're protected by the First Amendment. It protects us all from interference from the government. But, remember I said you have to know social and political context. This is a survey from 2016, First Amendment survey. 39% of Americans cannot name a single First Amendment freedom, not one. Most Americans, a big majority of Americans, can't name 2 or 3. And when they're asked to name First Amendment freedoms, they'll talk about religion and speech. Press often doesn't make the list. So while we enjoy First Amendment protection, you to a more limited extent, but in general, why we in the media enjoy First Amendment protection, most Americans don't know that, don't understand that. That's social and political context, and so you get things like this. This is from August of this year. Ipsos is a social political research organization, very well respected, statistically valid survey. 26% of Americans argue the president should have the authority to close news outlets engaged in bad behavior. Who defines bad behavior? You would suggest, we believe that under the First Amendment, you can't close down the press for saying things that somebody considers bad, but nearly half of Republicans think you can, and if you think it's just a Republican issue, you'd be wrong. It's about 1/3 of Democrats say the same thing. It's 1/3. Democrats say you can shut down the press if the president decides it's saying bad things. And 72% think it should be easier to sue reporters who knowingly publish false information. But what's false? Is it information that's truly fake, false, lies, or is it information that you don't like? So this is the social political context in which we're operating, which you're operating. Public doesn't understand what it means to do journalism under the protections of the First Amendment and in a society that values the marketplace of ideas. Nevertheless, if you step back for a minute and think about American history in the larger context, this is from the textbook I use in my media and society class. Journalism is the only media enterprise that democracy absolutely requires and is the only media practice in business specifically protected by the U.S. Constitution. With all of the trouble associated with it, with all of the misunderstanding, fundamentally, we are the only enterprise in American society protected specifically by the Constitution. That's a pretty powerful thing. So what it means is that all those people who don't think or appreciate the nature of the First Amendment and the protections it affords, they have a long and tough road to hoe to impose their ideas on the fundamental protections of the First Amendment. Well, Uncle Ben Parker, he says it very well, with great power comes great responsibility. We have these protections, we have the First Amendment, but we pay for that protection. We pay for the First Amendment. We pay with an obligation to be responsible, to practice the craft ethically and responsibly. So media ethics involves real-world problems, real-world issues that you encounter on a daily basis, maybe an hourly basis, and these days, maybe more often than that. It defines who we are as people and who we are as journalists. To be ethical is to be responsible. Unethical practice is, by definition, irresponsible. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. This is basically what I'm going to do today. Save that for those who want the PDF. This is how I view ethical behavior. This is kind of the framework that I use in my classes. I think of the rule of 4. There are 4 things that provide a framework for ethical decision making. And these apply to you as well as to me and to anybody else in the business. Laws, rules, standards, guidelines, and values. All of these are factors that help define ethical behavior and to which we can apply to an ethical problem to help us craft an ethical resolution. Laws can govern ethical behavior, but they don't always. I've got a couple of examples here. Killing is illegal and unethical. Is that correct? Is killing illegal? Yeah. Sorry? Yeah. Anybody want to dispute the yeah? When is killing legal? Self-defense, death penalty, law enforcement, military. In Florida, they have some, well, in other states, but Florida most notorious is stand your ground law. You can kill somebody if you feel there's an imminent threat to your life. I'm sorry? Idaho. Oh, yeah, stand your ground in Idaho too. So sometimes killing is legal, but some people would argue the death penalty is certainly not ethical. It's applied differently. Theft, illegal and unethical. Is stealing something always illegal? Most often stealing things is illegal, but it's not necessarily unethical, certainly not in our business. The Pentagon Papers back in the 1970s that changed the way the American government managed the war effort and changed the way the population felt about the Vietnam War and how we felt about government, they were stolen. But nowadays, nobody argues that publishing the Pentagon Papers was unethical. So sometimes something can be legal and unethical. Jim Crow in the South, in the Civil Rights era. Rosa Parks broke the law. It was illegal for her to sit at the front of the bus, but she was acting ethically, right? So sometimes the law gives us an idea of what may be legal, but doesn't necessarily answer the question of what is ethical. Rules. Now, violating a rule has consequences, but especially in our world, they're not criminal. They're not criminal. Nobody's going to knock on your door, put handcuffs on you, and haul you off to jail. So in the media world, we have this rule, do not plagiarize. Don't take somebody else's work and put your name on it and present it as your own. If you do that, you get fired, and your career can be ruined. You know, and that applies to people at the high school and the college levels. Nowadays, stuff like that goes viral so quickly, it'll stay on your Google search for the rest of your life. So you pay a penalty for violating that rule, but nobody's going to arrest you and put you in jail. You know, you're going to be free from prosecution. Journalism has rules. It has rules, and they are generally knowable rules. These are rules that you can learn and apply to your everyday practice. And so you know what the rules are, and if you violate the rules, you can anticipate certain consequences. Professional service contracts, those who go into broadcasting often operate under professional service contracts, and they'll specify rules that you have to apply. Personal and professional codes of conduct. Employee handbooks. For you all, school codes of conduct. I'm assuming that in most of your schools there's some kind of overriding code of conduct, some booklet of rules that you're made aware of. If not, you certainly learn what the rules are fairly quickly in your high school career, right? So you know what the rules are, and you know what you're supposed to do. So rules can provide some guidance on behavior. Standards and guidelines, and I recognize this can be a kind of a thin distinction, but there's a real distinction here. They're much less formal than rules. A rule is thou shalt not. A guideline is, well, maybe yes, maybe no, kind of depends. That's a guideline and a standard. Professional standards suggest how we ought to behave under certain circumstances, but they're always open for interpretation. They might very well be interpreted differently by different organizations, so that the consequences could be different. The codes of ethics, the industry codes of ethics, are full of guidelines and not full of rules. SPJ doesn't give you rules, it gives you guidelines on what ethical behavior should look like. But you're not breaking a rule if you define that in different terms. There may or may not be consequences. It depends on the organization, and they're often situational, interpreted differently. So one of the things you do when you find yourself in a new environment is try to understand what the standards are. Different than rules, what the standards are. And often you have to kind of learn those by studying the culture. They're not going to be presented to you in a booklet. Having said that, in my news organizations and in others, we gave all of our new employees our code of ethics. So it was clear what our standards and guidelines were. And here at the University of Idaho, all of our students in JAM are required to sign an academic integrity form. They sign it as a receipt to show that they have in fact read and understood our guidelines. Now the fourth part of the rule of four, kind of the hardest but the most personal. That's your values, the values you bring to the process. Personal values are the strong personal beliefs developed over time, acquired from family, peers, school, church, etc. All of you have probably pretty well developed set of personal values at this point. When students come to the University of Idaho as freshmen, if you ask them, what do you believe in? What's important to you? What are your values? You can get a pretty solid list. Values are relatively stable over time. They can change, but they're not mercurial. The values that you've adapted by early adulthood, pretty much your value set over time. You can change your opinion, but your fundamental beliefs are not that malleable in most circumstances. Then we have professional values, the core professional beliefs that are embodied in those rules, standards, and codes. Core professional beliefs. And so then, when you take on the profession, you're expected to operate in that professional values set. So when I call you all journalists, I expect you to be operating in the professional values set, understanding what those values are and applying those values as any journalist would apply those values. But you have this conflict. What happens when your personal values collide with your professional values? A deeply held personal belief collides with a value imperative of the profession. What do you do about it? And the ethicists say you can only do one thing. You have to adopt the values of the profession. At the core of every ethical dilemma, there's going to be a conflict of values. So if one of the things that you have to do is take the conflicting values and decide which value triumphs over the others. That's part of the decision-making process. And I'll just give you a very quick example. I use this in my classes. It's a classic values conflict that I encountered multiple times in all of my newspapers, but especially in the last couple of years at the Spokesman at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. You send our sons, our daughters, our husbands, our wives, aunts, uncles, friends, neighbors, you send them to war. And when you send people to war, some people die. And they come back to the United States for military-style funeral. And in these controversial wars of the early years of this century, there was hardly a community that was not in some way touched by these events. And so when the fallen military personnel would come home, they would come home, the coffin would be brought home, and there would be a funeral service, maybe a funeral service in a church. There would generally be a graveside service, and they follow the same format, especially at the graveside. You've got the family of the deceased, a widow, a widower, and the parents, and you've got relatives. They're all in black, veiled perhaps. And the coffin's flag draped. There's a military honor guard. They fire their salute. The flag is folded and presented to the mother or to the widow or widower. There are probably children. There may be children. People are caught in that moment in the most intense personal grief they're ever going to experience. The most intense personal grief they will ever experience. They could be sobbing. Children could be hysterical. As a journalist, you're there to report the story. The consequences of going to war have to be reported. This is big news. And when a fallen military person comes home, that's big news. but do you take the photo? That moment of most intense personal grief, do you take a picture of that widow or widower to illustrate the repercussions of war? One of the most important things a journalist can do. Or do you pull the camera back because it's invading the personal privacy of this individual at the moment of most intense grief? So, a value, journalistic value, serving the public interest. Public interest says we tell people what happens when we go to war. We tell them everything. We show the repercussions. We serve the public interest versus this fundamental commitment, it's in the codes of ethics, that we protect the privacy of the people that we're dealing with, the subjects of our work. So do we invade the widow's privacy and take the photo for the benefit of the public, or do we back off to protect her privacy? That's a clash of values. And you've got to decide which value is going to win out. Public need to know versus their right to privacy. So that's what I mean about values. Now, as an individual, you may grow up believing that this right to privacy, this right to be left alone, is at the core of your belief system. But when you become a journalist, you have to adopt the values and practices of the profession. And the public service to the public need to know, is the highest value of a journalist. If you cannot make that decision, then ethicists will say you need to find a different profession. Which is not me saying you always make that decision, but you have to be prepared to make that decision as a journalist. So when they conflict, you're obligated to take on the values of the profession. Give you a real quick run through of the codes of ethics so that you kind of know the code context. This is the Society of Professional Journalists, 1926. Sorry, I said 1924. 1926, it was a joint effort of SDX, Sigma Delta Chi, and the American Society of Newspaper Editors. It's been updated many times. My colleague, Professor Talent, who's been on the national board of the society for some period of time, participated in one full rewrite in 1999, and then was part of the revision in 2014. That's fair, yeah. And so probably knows this code better than anybody else that I know. There are some others that apply to journalists, depending on where you work. Some of these might be important. American Society of News Editors used to be newspaper editors. Associated Press Managing Editors, which is also primarily newspapers. Those two organizations are now merging. National Press Photographers Association, still in video photography, are represented here. Very active organization, very active in ethical responses to content that might be viewed as offensive, photographs that might be viewed as offensive. And the Radio Television Digital News Association, which represents radio, television, trying to advance themselves into online. One standard for all, tell the truth. Of course, we could have another conversation for another day about what is the truth. You all understand the nature of the concept of provisional truth? Provisional truth is the truth we know right now, and it could change. So you're watching all the reporting over the last couple days about those bombs that were delivered back east to various political activists, former President Obama, Hillary Clinton, et cetera. The stories that are reporting these events are telling you the truth, but as new information comes out, that truth might change. It's not that they're misrepresenting, they're just reporting what they know, and what they know is going to change and develop as the investigation moves forward. That's what we call provisional truth. That's our obligation, to know the truth of the moment. This is the SPJ code. I'll make this PDF available to everybody, but you can also, I'll give you the SPJ website here in a little bit. It's broken out into 4 parts: seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently. Take a look at the language there, I'm going to come back to that. And be accountable and transparent. It was revised in 2014, and these were some of the big changes. It now applies to acts of journalism. So it defines, it's no longer limited to journalists, however you might define journalists. It speaks to acts of journalism. It applies to you all, committing acts of journalism. Transparency, a fundamental value. You have to be able to stand up and explain what you're doing and why, and defend it, sometimes on the spot. Places responsibility to the public is the highest ethical value. It's always been there, but it's really well stated now. Emphasizes accuracy in the digital age and encourages civil dialogue with news consumers. I had a reputation for being a little bit snarky in my communication with readers who were upset with me. I would be in violation of the new SPJ standard. Here's RTDNA. RTDNA now meets jointly with SPJ in annual convention. They revised their code just a couple of, 1 year later. And you can see the echoes of SPJ. There's really not a whole lot of distinction, although it's couched in terms that speak a little more directly to broadcast and digital. But truth and accuracy above all, independence and transparency, accountability for consequences. This is a group that's gaining in importance. And if I had the time, if you have the time, I want you to understand SPJ, of course, but this is one worth your time. Online News Association is the fastest growing of the professional organizations in our business, as you might expect, because digital news is so much more important. 2,500 members, the website is journalist.org. The really nice thing about Online News Association, and you advisors might keep this in mind, if you wanted to build your own code of ethics for your newspaper, they've got sort of a wiki system, a build your own code. And you don't have to pay dues or be a member to engage in this build your own code of ethics. So it will give you some scenarios and some questions, and as you respond, it will help you build a code of ethics specific to your organization. It's very cool. I've done it a couple of times just for the heck of it, and I found that it does make it easy to kind of represent what I believe in. This is their lead values statement, and I bring it to you because it really sort of speaks to the media, news, journalistic ethical standards for the digital age, for internet. And so many of you now are operating on the internet. The most powerful communications medium. As digital delivery systems become the primary source of news, it presents complex challenges and opportunities for journalists as well as the news audience. Access is huge in this code of ethics. People should have access to internet information. But as journalists, we have an obligation to make sure that that information, I knew I was going to do that, is true and accurate. These are their values: editorial integrity, independence, journalistic excellence, freedom of expression, and freedom of access. Those last two really speaking directly to the issues of the digital age. And here's your build your own code of ethics. And I've included the URL to that so that when I send the PDF to Becky, if she wants to share it with you, the URL is right there. But if you just go to journalist.org, to the Online News Association, you can find your way to the build your own code real fast. Now, codes can help solve ethical dilemmas. They're the best source for understanding professional values. So when I talk about adapting your personal values to your professional values, these are a great source. They can suggest appropriate professional practice. They offer some guidance on actions to take in certain situations, but they're advisory. They're not directive. So this is our ethical rule of 4 again. These are the 4 qualities that you want to bring to your decision making. Is our resolution legal? The fact that it may be illegal doesn't mean it's not your resolution. You just need to understand the consequences. Ethicists will tell you that as a journalist, if you decide to break the law, you can do so if you can make an ethical argument. It's a pretty high bar, but you have to be able to accept the consequences. You can't run and hide. You got to stand up and defend your decision. Does our resolution comply with the applicable rules? Are we breaking a stated professional rule? And there aren't a lot of them. Are we meeting professional standards and guidelines? This is where the codes can be helpful. And how do our personal professional values influence our decision? What do we believe in? What do we believe in as human beings, as people? How do we reconcile those with the obligations of our profession? Now, this is your dilemma. In a sense, it can be the dilemma of college journalists as well. It could be a dilemma here at the University of Idaho, except for a commitment, long-standing, decades-old commitment on the part of the administration to be hands-off from student media, but that could change. It's changeable. Journalists generally consider you to be journalists, subject to professional standards and codes of ethics. So when I look at what you do, I'm using the lens of professionalism. But the law denies you, and some college journalists, the First Amendment protections afforded professionals. You do not have the same level of First Amendment protection. School administrators, as publishers and academics, can impose standards of behavior that can compromise journalistic ethical standards. And we see this happen around the country on a regular basis. What would you say, a couple times a month, Becky? At least. We see student journalists whose work is thwarted by standards imposed by their publishers, who are in fact their teachers and administrators. The school district is your publisher, and they can impose rules. Now some would say, didn't you work for a publisher? Could your publisher not impose rules on you? And absolutely true. In the private sector, I reported to a publisher. He was my boss. And if he didn't like something I was doing, he could fire me. I've been fired before by a publisher who didn't like what I was doing. But I always had the opportunity to say, I'm not going to do that, or I am going to do that. It's up to you to take action. Fire me, or I'll resign and take my act somewhere else. So there's a distinction between operating in the private sector and having the freedom to make an ethical decision and accept consequences from the situation that you find yourselves in. I can't argue against that system because that's the system we have. So this is your rule of 4 expanded to 5. Is your resolution legal? Does it comply with applicable rules? Are we meeting professional standards and guidelines? How do our professional and personal values influence our decision? And is our decision consistent with school and school administrative policies? You have to ask that question to understand where you stand as a journalist in the environment in which you're operating. Does it comply? Some common ethical predicaments. Privacy, probably the most common ethical issue that I see in high school and even college papers. The standard in the profession is the public's right or need to know versus a commitment to privacy, mere or lurid curiosity. Are you telling people something important that they need to know for their lives, or are you just satisfying their curiosity, their lurid curiosity? So student newspapers that have gossip columns, that engage in kind of personal reporting on people who are operating within the school, school leaders or the elites, the movers and shakers, the mean girls. I'm trying to pull out every cliched trope I can think of. But when you engage in that kind of journalism, you wander into this area of privacy. The ethical standard is, do people need to know this, or am I just trying to satisfy their curiosity? Conflicts of interest, situations where a student journalist may benefit personally from a story he or she produces. In most environments, if you participate on the football team, you shouldn't be writing sports for the school newspaper. That's a conflict of interest. Your coverage has the potential to benefit you or your friends or colleagues. That's a conflict of interest. In a school environment, it's very difficult to achieve complete separations. It's too small. And students are involved in way too many activities. And it could be that the only person available to write sports is a member of the football team or the basketball team or the volleyball team. So it's not possible to have the separation that we have in the professional world, which is an absolute separation of personal and professional interests. So there are other things you can do. Transparency is a fundamental ethical value. So if the story is being written by somebody who is intimately involved in the activity or the event, you just make note of that as an editor's note or in the story. Joe Jones is a member of the football team, and an editor's note that you put at the top of the story about the football season. That's about the best you can do. Offensive content. Think about offensive content in the broadest possible terms. The broadest possible terms. Some offensive content relates to kind of the usual stuff, sex, drugs. I remember one of the newspapers that was in Becky's summer program some years back had done a fashion spread highlighting new fall fashions, and some of the pictures displayed students in apparel that was not appropriate by school administrative standards. That was offensive. Showing female students in skimpy attire is viewed as offensive by some people. So offensive content, offending the audience for a greater good. If you're going to take on that battle, you better have a larger purpose. Are you showing those photos just because you want to titillate, or is there some larger purpose? Are you writing about school dress codes in a way that gives readers an understanding of how rules apply to them and how they might be changing, maybe how they're applied differently to men and women? Offensive language. Offensive language isn't just the language that is clearly pejorative. You can think of all the pejorative, ugly terms applied to race or gender identity. And of course, those are pretty easy for us to avoid. But one of the issues now is understanding social and cultural context. And so some language that might have been acceptable a couple of years ago is no longer acceptable. Ways that we reference sexual assault have changed in just the last 18 months. It's part of the Me Too movement. So understanding the context, the social cultural context within which we operate, can help you avoid language, terminology that is no longer valid. I thought this issue was settled, but just in the last few months, I've seen another renewed debate over the term retarded, what's called in some circles the R word. You have to understand that context when you're talking about people who might be challenged in one way or another. And then public service reporting. A lot of high school papers have simply backed off this, because in this day and age, whenever you're talking about public service reporting, you're writing and reporting in an environment where the American public is divided politically and socially. And no matter what you do, you're going to piss somebody off, right? Coverage of local politics, school policies, administrative actions, teacher and student discipline. Big national case just in the last few months about a high school paper that was trying to report on the firing of a popular teacher for inappropriate sexual conduct with students, and was shut down by the administration. These are always going to be tough stories for you to report. We're in the midst of maybe the most important midterm elections in a couple of generations. How many high school news organizations are writing about the political climate? How many are writing about the potential impact of one candidate over another, over policies that are going to affect you in education? How many people are writing about this incredibly important congressional race in Eastern Washington, pitting Kathy McMorris Rodgers, the incumbent, against Lisa Brown, an educator? When you wade into these waters, you are wading into controversy. So you have to understand that. Now, should you wade into those waters? Should you wade into those waters? That's a question that I can't answer for you. And in some cases, your advisors can't even answer for you. In all of these issues, there's rarely a single answer, almost never a single answer. Almost never. We deal in shades of gray. It's very shaky, fuzzy, squishy ground. Faced with an identical set of facts, different practitioners will reach different conclusions. But our goal is to create a decision-making process that allows us to make an ethical and defensible decision that we can explain to people on demand, because we will be asked. And this is the process. What's the first question I need to resolve? What are the competing values and principles? How do I reconcile those with professional practices, the codes, laws and regulations, rules and guidelines? And what is the final resolution that I can defend? And then I'll wrap up with the next couple of thoughts, which are in some ways empowering and in some ways discouraging. No matter what you do, your readers are not going to understand. They will not understand. They won't understand your role. They won't understand your obligations. They don't know what it really means to have a free and engaged press. They're unlikely to understand that you operate under professional standards and obligations. Those standards and obligations say you do not serve special interests. There's a line in the SPJ code, I like to think of it as the spokesman review line, that grows out of an ethical controversy that my organization had to deal with, that says we're not even responsible to our owners, our bosses. I'm not responsible to my publisher. I make decisions based on how they will serve the public. Public won't understand that. They will not understand when your obligation puts you in a position to be critical of or opposing their own interests. They're unlikely to understand why your obligations differ from their own. And all of the above likely includes your parents, teachers, and school administrators. It's a sad thing on a national basis. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody in this room because I couldn't. I don't know enough. But on a national basis, it's a very sad thing that we have administrators in secondary education who have no clue about what it means to have student journalists operating in your world. Don't understand the First Amendment, don't understand the law, don't know how to apply the law, and simply try to control the flow of information. This is a given. You need to go into this understanding this given. And so this is one of my last values that I'll share with you. If you're going to do this, you got to be fearless. You got to be fearless. Not all of you are headed to media careers. I wouldn't expect that, but some in this room are. Maybe 3, 4, or 5 of you are going to find yourself in my position someday. And this is a value that you have to embrace. Fearlessness. Because you're going to get in trouble. If you don't get in trouble in high school, you'll get in trouble in college. Or you get in trouble in your first job. Or if you're like me, you're going to get in trouble all the way up and down the line. And you can't be afraid of it. You have to embrace it. You actually have to understand that if you embrace it, it can be kind of fun and liberating. It's who you become. It's who you are. And you've got this history behind you to support it. You have to remember who you serve. You'll have to understand that there will always be conflicts if you do your job and do it well, that you have obligations to your teachers and administrations, but those obligations can conflict with your values as a journalist. And so you negotiate. You negotiate the conflicts as you determine how best to serve your public. And, as I note here, you got to learn to pick your fights. Now, you're upholding a tradition when you do this. You're upholding a tradition because these people who carved the way for us were in your shoes, in your chairs. John Peter Zenger, the great colonial journalist who went to prison because the royal governor of New York didn't like what he wrote. Horace Greeley, yes, he said, "Go west, young man, go west," but he was a champion of abolition. And he was the classic newspaper editor who produced the wall that separates news from opinion. Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, yeah, they were scandal mongers and yellow journalists, but they were also pioneers in investigative reporting and championing the underdog. Nellie Bly and Annie Laurie, the Sob sisters, the stunt girls who paved the way for women journalists. Ida Wells and Ida Tarbell, who make the list in the top 25 of most influential people of the 20th century. Not women, but people of the 20th century. Ida Tarbell, who you've probably never heard of, is almost every list of top 10. Edward R. Murrow, graduated from Washington State College, champion of journalistic ethics and values. Katharine Graham and Ben Bradley, publisher and editor of the Washington Post, at a time that most clearly parallels our own contentious time, Watergate. And Walter Cronkite, flawed in some ways, but the most trusted man in America for a reason. Anchor, longtime anchor for CBS News. So, this is what they did, this is what I want you to do if you're going to follow this path. Tell people what you know when you know it. You know it, you report it. Because if you don't tell people what you know, they'll never trust you, ever. Cover the news without fear or favor. Nobody gets special treatment, not even yourselves. Give voice to the voiceless and defend the defenseless. If we don't do that, who will? Who's going to give voice to the people who have no voice? Who are the disenfranchised people within your public that never get a say, whose word is never heard? Be transparent, be accountable. No secrets. Everything you do is open book. And pick your fights. Not every fight is worth, every win is worth the fight. Pick the fights that are worth fighting. Famous case out of Pennsylvania, some years back now, within the last 5 years. Student editors at a Pennsylvania high school where their nickname and their mascot, Redskins. A racist term, we're fighting about that term in the NFL with the Washington NFL team. And the editors of that paper, over 2 cycles, 2 years, said, we're not going to use that term. We're not going to call our team the Redskins, and we're not going to put that term in our newspaper. And the principal ordered them to do it. Literally ordered them. You must, if you're going to stay in school, you must use that term. And they fought for 2 years, took it to the courts and fought it. Won some, lost some. 2 different iterations. And these were some of the resources they called on, and I'm going to end with this. That's the website for spj.org. Lots of resources on ethics, on law, advice, people to contact, and the Student Press Law Center, which represents students, student journalists, represents you. It's a resource for you. They have lawyers. They take legal action. So advisors, forgive me, that should be on every one of your cell phones. And I'll make this PDF available to Becky, and she can share it with you if you're all interested with all of these references.